Welcome to Psychosocial Wednesdays, our project that we've been running for several months now. We've been very pleased with how it's been going. As you know, our intention was to have a wide variety of particularly Jungian guests presenting to an international audience, which we've been doing since then. For several months since we started, we've been doing this every 2 weeks. That was actually our intention, that because of lockdown, because everyone was home and bored, that we would do this to give them something to do, basically. So we're now returning to what was actually our original plan, which is holding these once a month, about in the middle of the month. And then, of course, we will also have occasional book launches, who knows what else. The intention is to continue doing various kinds of things, hopefully for years, who knows. We're still advertising how to get in on Facebook and through the several email lists, and it's my responsibility to eventually put together a website, which I haven't yet, so that's my fault. Another early intention that we're still working with is we had decided from the beginning that we wanted both senior and junior Jungians, and people who weren't Jungians, people from other areas associated with our interests. And so far we'd only had senior people, and we thought we would start having someone. Joel is indeed junior. He's younger than I am, and he's one of our classmates. As you may know, Bernhard, Stefano, and I all studied at the Jung Institute in Zurich, and so did Joel. He graduated a few years ago. In addition, this time, because Joel is a musician who's working on music psychoanalysis, music counseling, something bigger than that, looking for a bigger frame of possibilities around what we know often as music therapy. And we've also invited a number of music therapists, and we'll see if we can have some exchange between people's different backgrounds. Our intention is, as usual, in a moment I'll briefly introduce Joel and also say, basically let him go give his presentation for 20, 25, 30 minutes. We'll then move it out to questions from you, which you can do questions by going to the chat box and typing them in there. Bernhard is on hand. He'll be watching the chat box and taking questions out of there, sending them to me, and I'll then ask Joel. So we'll see how that works. So welcome everyone. Very good to see everyone. We're nearing 50 now, so that's nice. Very pleased to introduce Joel Kroeker with the title Jungian Music Psychotherapy, When Psyche Sings. Joel is Swiss trained, which means, as I just said, the Jung Institute in Zurich, the one we're all terribly proud of. And he's been a music-centered psychotherapist registered for a time in Western Canada, in Victoria, British Columbia. And he also has a substantial background as a musician, as a performing musician, and as a teaching musician. So I'm very pleased to introduce him and say, thank you, Joel. Why don't you tell us what you've got?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Paul, and thanks for the opportunity, this, resurrecting this format. Actually, it reminds me of something that I once heard from Dr. David Miller about the Eros circle in the 70s, about the spirit of the event, which I kind of feel maybe here is for presenters to speak at the edge of their discipline. You know, what's still in process, what's at the edge, not the regurgitated sort of pre-rehearsed, but, you know, there is something pre-rehearsed, of course. I wrote a book and published it, but to speak at the edge of this theme, and particularly with your comments and ideas. I'm very interested in how these ideas will be taken in and what will happen in your minds about these ideas. So maybe I'll start off with giving you a little bit of a sense of where these ideas come from. For me, I realized recently after publishing the book that I've been thinking about these things for about 25 years in my case, because I wrote a paper that I long forgot about 25 years ago as a composition student called Jungian Music Therapy, which I totally forgot it existed. But I realized afterwards, only now, that to think as a composer is actually very helpful for me to think as a Jungian analyst. That framework of being bilocated, like the composer is, being in the minutiae of the musical interaction, this interaction, and also the meta-narrative, to have these two locations at once, is quite a capacity, I think, to develop, and a very important one for a composer and for a Jungian analyst. So I've realized there's a connection there, there's a link. After that composition degree, I did a degree in ethnomusicology, and realized more recently that actually that's also very helpful to look at the relationship between music and culture, and how, and what I call microculture, actually, the microcultural moment of what is happening right now in this interaction, culturally speaking. What's the meaning of this music? What's the meaning of of our interaction? And to stay open, like an anthropologist must, like an ethnomusicologist must. And after that, I escaped a PhD program in order to become a musician and travel the world as a singer-songwriter for about 10 years. And that also has been helpful to sort of study the power and potency of music, what it can do, its limitations and what it can do from the stage as a performer. That's also something that's, I think, very important in a music-oriented analysis. Not to perform intentionally necessarily, but to realize there is some performance. There is performance going on, and to realize what the possibilities are there. And then I did a degree in psychotherapy, and that really focused the lens on music as a healing modality, psyche therapia, to heal the soul. And then eventually became a Jungian analyst in Switzerland, as Paul mentioned. And the Jungian analytic psychology frame is really the most potent and helpful frame I've found so far, because of the symbolic attitude, this multivalent, alive place that is the analytic frame from Jung's perspective, I think, or from a Jungian perspective. So that's sort of why I still live within that world. So I'd like to start off by showing you a slide, if I can. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to share my PowerPoint, and then I'm going to move along to the next. Whoops. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so that's, hopefully you're seeing that. These are the chapters of the book. I know it's a very dense slide, and the rest of them aren't like this, but it shows you the width and breadth of what I was trying to explore in the book, and kind of in this very short introduction that I'm doing today. But I want to simplify this, for the sake of what we're doing right here. I want to simplify this and make a relationship between musicking and dreaming. Let me see if I'm going to make sure I'm sharing my share screen, and boom, and boom. So there's this term that I'm going to use, musicking. It's a little awkward, but it's from Christopher Small in New Zealand. And I'd like to make the relationship here between musicking and dreaming. So the experience of dreaming, everything you think and know about the experience of dreaming. I'm sure lots of you work with dreams, your own and other people's. And I want to invite us to transfer, generalize what we know and think and imagine about the reverie experience of dreaming over to the experience of musicking. And musicking is music as a verb, as a process, not as a noun, not as the reductive sign, but as the open, alive, symbolic, full space of musical interaction, musical experience, being inside music. listening, playing, composing, imagining, even dreaming about music during the day or the night. So I want to make this relationship because I think that builds a bridge right away for the Jungian world, everything we can know about analytical psychology and the psyche, you know, over to this experience that I'm trying to describe today, experience and process. So, you know, pardon me?
Excuse me, you're showing, by the way, the frame around the PowerPoint, not just the PowerPoint.
Right. Thank you for that, Paul. I'm sort of dithering back and forth here between.
It's a tricky thing.
So, but I appreciate that. I like to say that music is a waking dream with a soundtrack. And I like this phrase because it highlights the active imagination component of the musical experience, but also, so the waking aspect, but also the active aspect of what happens or can happen in a musical space, in the musical field, you know, the poetic energized domain of entering a musical field. And that this can happen quite intentionally, that we can open to this in our waking ego stance, except when we can't, which I think is even more interesting. We can when we can, but as Thomas Ogden says about dream thinking, when we can't, we can't. And noticing that when we've been kicked out of the alive, open space of the musical experience, when we've been kicked out for some reason onto the concrete, the literalized, concretized space, the shallow place where we can no longer musically think, that's also very much worthy of identifying. How did I get kicked out? How did I lose the symbolic attitude? How did I lose the alive, open space? And now I'm thinking in urgent literalization. What's happening here? How did this happen? So I have some thoughts about what that is. But before I sort of go into that, I'd like to read you one short paragraph from the book. It's page 1 of the book, and I want to try to read that. I want to read this because I want to try to just show you what I mean when I say music. It's pretty wide, what I'm talking. It's metaphoric, right? Literal, but more metaphoric. So here it is. We live in an energized, activated field of music. The simple realization that our world is made of vibrational frequencies seems to have an immediate impact on our moment-by-moment experience and how we relate to sound in our daily life. For example, your refrigerator hums at about 60 cycles per second, which you may experience as slightly flat of the note B, while the red in the autumn leaves outside your kitchen window vibrate at a rate of approximately 430 trillion cycles per second, at a wavelength of about 695 billionths of a meter. Even the human body is said to have a base rate of vibration between 5 hertz and 10 hertz. And every element in our current periodic table is based on energy at various rates of vibration. So there you go. That's the quote that I'd like to use to sort of prove something, if there's something to prove here, that our entire world is actually quite literally made of music in this way. According to our current scientific materialistic view, right? This is our current mythology and narrative. The world is vibrating. My voice is vibrating, and you're picking it up, even through this technology. How does this turn into meaning? How does this turn into consciousness? How does it turn into mental images for you right now? I shake the air with my vocal cords. It goes through these concatenations of Zoom, you know, and then and out of your speakers into your ears, the cilia in your ear shake, transforms it into an electrical impulse, and then eventually turns it into meaning. This is a pretty amazing thing to imagine. There are some gaps in that trajectory, right? We don't know much about how it turns into consciousness. We can't tell the story all the way through. There are gaps in our story. But I'd like to talk about those gaps. That's actually what I'm interested in. How does sound become meaning? I call it the auditory digestive system. That our psyche actually digests sound into meaning. And it's doing this all the time. Consciously, partially consciously, not at all consciously, and even maybe in a psychoid kind of experience, a little bit conscious, not very conscious, you know. Maybe thinking of Jung's map of the psyche is helpful here to think like, what's going on? Where is this music landing? You know, right in the dead center of ego, or is it landing somewhere else? Not only music, but sound, raw sound, you know, unorganized raw sound, or very organized composed sound. Something someone's saying or singing, or music itself in its literal form. All of this is raw sound, and I think our psyche is very much involved in a creative way. So I like to call this, there's a principle that I like to refer to here, at least for myself, and the principle is perception is a creative act, not merely a receptive one. I think this is true. Perception is actually a creative act. But maybe this is not the way we think in our default thinking. We might think that sound is coming in and, you know, it's just affecting us. But actually, I think there is an auditory digestive system that's actually transforming it into meaning, or pouring these sounds into the unconscious world, or the personal unconscious, or maybe into the partially conscious. So I think the psyche is very active in its interaction with music, even in a receptive way. And I say in quotes, receptive, you know. I think even receptive music, receiving music that way, is a creative act. We're curating the sound and our aesthetic experience of it all the time. So one question we can ask ourselves is, what kind of music is this particular interaction that's happening? You know, in session, for example, in the consulting room. What kind of music? What genre of music? You know, is this a love song? Is this ceremonial music? Is this an advertising jingle? What kind of music? And then, of course, we could even go deeper. What elements of the musical field are happening right now? What kind of dynamics are happening? Soft and slow, loud and fast, or anything in between? Is there a movement in the musical aspect we can hear musically? I remember one time Dieter Baumann, Jung's grandson, he was teaching before he passed away, he was teaching at the Jung Institute, and I remember having what I found a wonderful experience of asking him directly about experiences with music with his grandfather. And he talked about his, you know, he played the keyboard, and Dieter Baumann played the keyboard, and he played for Jung's birthday one time, and, you know, talking about Jung's response to music. And he told me, and I think some others were there too, that Jung listened to his patients as music. Well, we do that now because the field of music therapy has helped us become conscious of that kind of way of thinking, which only started in around 1950. Well, Jung was already doing that. He was quite progressive in his way of listening, I think, according to Dieter's stories. So what I'm suggesting, one thing that I'm suggesting here is, I know this is quite provocative to say this for a junior analyst like myself, but I think actually, because the world is literally made of music, I think we actually need a new form of depth psychology in order to make sense of what happens when we're inside the musical ecosystem. And I don't mean a totally new form of depth psychology. I don't think we have to start from scratch, of course. Jungian analytical psychology has gone a really long way to help with this form of depth psychology, as has the field of music-centered psychotherapy and other fields too, the larger psychoanalytic field as well, of course. But I think we need to go further. I think actually we haven't gone far enough in our thinking, writing, and discourse about a form of a music-oriented psychoanalysis, let's say. I mean, for lack of a better word. I actually call it, so far, I call it archetypal music psychotherapy. Those are the 3 words that I use for the work that I do. And maybe I'd like to include now not only what kind of music is this particular interaction within the archetypal music psychotherapy modality that I'm imagining, but also what do we not hear? Like I mentioned, what do we not hear and why do we not hear it? I think this is a very interesting and important aspect to pay attention to as well. It's like the field of it's like dark matter in the universe, right? Or the dark web on the internet. You know, beneath the internet is the dark web. The aspects that are unheard, the unheard music of our world, the unheard music in our consulting room or in our interaction with our partner, what is up till now impossible to hear until we can hear it. That's what I'm focusing on, that experience. What do we defend against, resist against, make ourselves deaf to? You know, blind spots, well, deaf spots. What are we actively deafening ourselves to in the interaction? I would say lots. You know, I think that's true for almost any interaction. So you can probably sense by now that I'm also not only speaking literally about music, but I'm also speaking metaphorically about music, symbolically, right? Beyond its concretized and reductive parameters. So I think we actually do music and ourselves a disservice when we imagine it too small. So this is part of what I'm inviting as well, is not, I'm inviting us, maybe this is a double negative, I'm inviting us not to imagine music too small. And that's asking a lot, you know, to not imagine the interaction too small, but to let it be what it's capable of, the musical field. And that's a lot. The musical field, I think, is capable of a lot. For example, along with icons, for example, you know, visual imagery, we have earcons. Earcons is actually a term that came up by a guy named Duncanson in 1994. And these are auditory symbols. I'm going to show you, let's see if this is helpful. I'm going to show you a visual. It's funny that we say visual about this, but auditory symbols, earcons, a sound-based icon. I know I've got it's a minimized screen right now, but I'm just going to show you the minimized screen. Hopefully you can see that. Auditory symbols, like this page of music from R. Murray Schafer, a Canadian composer. Sound-based icons. And what a sound-based icon is capable of showing. Here's my graphic for the auditory digestive system that converts sound into meaning, like an earcon. I mean, imagine this. The sounds around you, the soundscape. Maybe we'd call it the biosphere or the is it called the anthrosphere? I forget what it's called, but anyway, there's that biosphere, the anthrophony, that's it. The anthrophony, the world of human sounds, the biophony, the world of non-human animal sounds. There's another one too, the ecosphere or something, which is the world of non-human, completely non-animal sounds. This is always happening around us, and all of this is pouring in, and we're doing something with this, consciously or very much unconsciously. This is what I'm suggesting. And I think Jung was suggesting this too, not only about sound, right, but phenomenal world is being worked on by our psyche system, the self-regulating system. I called the book Jungian Music Psychotherapy. I'm going to stop sharing here for a second. I called this book Jungian Music Psychotherapy partially because I needed a title, but partially because I wanted to signal these 3 images with these 3 words. I think it's very much connected to the Jungian analytical psychology way of seeing, imagining, hearing. Music, of course, in its largest form. And then psychotherapy for lack of a better word, really, just the umbrella category of how to relate, how psyche relates to sound. That's what I'm getting at. How psyche relates to sound, and that's the subtitle, When Psyche Sings. So the premise, one of the main premises of the book and this talk is actually that music is a field. Music is a location, a temenos, a sacred space, or I like to say an energized poetic domain. But it's a special kind of energized poetic domain within which unbearable aspects of the self can be expressed and heard, perhaps for the first time, even before they can be experienced verbally or visually or in any other way. So think about this. We're talking about unrepresented content, you know, non-representational content, which is a very interesting subfield now in psychoanalysis, a part of field theory as well, right? The unrepresented proto-content that has not yet become content that we can name. We're talking pre-experience in a kind of way. I know this is a very, very vague place to try to talk about, right? But this is important, I think. There's a space, perhaps, that we're imagining, right? And sometimes experiencing, that is pre-content, pre-consciousness. But something is there. This is what we're saying. And what I'm saying is that, or that's what the larger field is saying, what I'm saying here is the musical field is capable of letting that exist. And not only exist, but coexist with polarities. Opposites and polarities, and all within that spectrum, that cancel each other out within consciousness, but in the musical field, they don't necessarily cancel each other out. They can coexist without deleting or obliterating each other. So hopefully that gets something going for you in your own thinking. Some of you are shaking your head and some of you are nodding your head. So, okay. I shouldn't say hopefully. I should never say that word. But what I mean is, think about how you imagine the importance of polarities within the work that you do. Polarities. Think about transcendent function, Jung's work with alchemy, the one becomes two become the axiom of Maria. What the importance of polarities is, holding the tension of opposites till the transcendent third arrives. This kind of idea in classical Jungian psychology, analytical psychology. And now what I'm saying here is the musical field, the poetic energized domain, has a way of letting coexist what we're conscious of and what is its opposite from a conscious perspective. Of course, within the self, opposites can coexist, of course. But within the conscious musical experience, they can coexist as well. The reason that's important, one image for why that's important, is because music can be recorded. Improvisations can be recorded. They can be captured in a kind of way and then listened to again in a way that our unconscious world might not be able to be in quite as explicit of a way. So to try to be tangible about this, in the consulting room, in a music-oriented analysis, where music is part of the process, we can improvise together, create spontaneous music, record that music, and then we can both put our instruments down and listen back to the recording, and both of us become observers and listeners. We can take that new vantage point. This is like, and now we can listen for what is coexisting in those, what elements are polarized and existing in, like a wave and a particle in quantum physics, right? Both can exist. And we can hear it together. We can pick that up together. Sometimes, not always, right? But sometimes we have that chance then Even with listening together, you know, not everyone's a musician, right? Of course, not everyone's, you know, plays music. So we can listen together. We can listen to a piece of music together in that same kind of way. We can even talk about music together. We can imagine music together. We can ask questions of ourselves about music. What has been a piece of music that's been particularly important in your life, or that particular time in your life during that trauma? You know, what kind of music preceded it, happened during it, happened afterwards? We can do this as a kind of a musical autobiography. All of these different ways are utilizing the musical field. There's more to say about this, but I'm just going to move on a little bit because we're just about out of time. I've just got a few minutes before the 30-minute mark. So another word I like to use for the musical field is the zone of activation. And the reason I say zone of activation is because this temenos allows us to experience the music, metaphorically speaking, without resolving, foreclosing, or emptying out the tension. If we manage to do this, the potential is to load up the libido within the musical field, allowing us to remain inside the processing of what I call the symbiotic musical ecosystem. I know I said a lot of things there, but you know, those images, maybe that sparks something to be in the symbiotic musical field and not foreclose, not resolve. It's so tempting to foreclose and resolve, right? And to go for something literal. Do I like it? Do I not like it? Is this good music or bad music? Is this dissonant or consonant? Can I handle it or do I want to reject it? All of that is foreclosing. To not do that allows the musical field to have its power, to have its actual loaded power. This is holding the tension, what I'm describing, within the musical field. A composer knows how to do this. This is what a composer must know how to do. Performer too, musical performer, and even an ethnomusicologist, to understand what is totally ununderstandable at first. So, similar to the landscape of a dream, within the musical field, multiple levels. I'm saying the same thing now in a different way. Multiple levels of relevance can coexist without canceling each other out, which allows seemingly irrelevant aspects to maintain a position, even when their value is not yet clear. And that's the main point, right? When their value is not yet clear, we want to delete anything that's value is not yet clear. We want to go straight to the value. Well, what I'm suggesting is the music doesn't do that. The musical field allows irrelevant aspects to exist. It's our conscious curating of the aesthetic, you know, aesthetic curation, like an art curator, right? This is good. This is going to go here. We aesthetically curate, and I'm suggesting that when we do that, not bad, but it actually throws a lot of irrelevant pieces out before they can constellate into something of even more value, before the pattern can emerge, before something important can constellate. I'm thinking about Einstein's theory of relativity, something so simple, you know, E equals mc squared, something like that can pop out of tremendous tension of holding irrelevant aspects, maybe for years, maybe for decades, and then pow, the little unified theory pops out. And this is true in the consulting room too. We have to have examples of success here to motivate us to do this, because it's hard, it's difficult, it's confusing, it's disorienting to hold the irrelevant aspects, you know, in that constellated field. The way I like to think of it is it jumps into consilience. It jumps into a constellated field of meaning. Perhaps, not always, but sometimes. I know I just have a few seconds here left. I want to just show you an image because I think it might be helpful. Let's just, whoops, that's not quite right. Let's do this instead. I'm going to just share screen. I want to show you an image that's moving. hopefully that's moving for you. It's Thelonious Monk. It's a jazz quartet. Thelonious Monk at the piano and his band. And they're improvising. You're not hearing them. You're just seeing it, right? But maybe in your mind, you can hear it. You know, maybe you've heard Thelonious Monk or jazz music in general. In that group, they're playing according to a certain tune. But in jazz, they play the head of the song, the melodies, and then they go way far away into some kind of different world of sound, you know, they listen so carefully to each other that if the saxophone plays something outside of the key, right, they're in the key of C, and then all of a sudden the sax player plays an F sharp, well, that's outside of the key of C. Well, they hear that and they start to alter and they go with that saxophone player. Well, this is what I'm suggesting. This is what our psyche is capable of. Not only unconscious, conscious. The center of consciousness in our psyche is capable of this. And I would recommend it, you know, to say it in a kind of a silly way, but this kind of image, I think, is very helpful. How accommodating and flexible the psyche is in taking in permutations and changes and transformations and something irrelevant, right? F sharp is irrelevant in the key of C until you hear, oh, it's not irrelevant. It's just another note. Let's go there. Now we're in the key of C with an F sharp. You know, you might want to say, well, that's the, what is it, Lydian mode. Well, that's literalizing. No, we're not in the Lydian mode. We're just here. Sounds. Here we go. Let's go with that F sharp. How does it feel, right? Of course, I have more, but you know what? I think I probably should stop. And I noticed that there's comments coming in. Let's see what kind of, I'm really curious to hear what your thoughts, ideas, what this sparks for you. So thanks for sticking with me on this. Paul and Bernard, do you want to
Yes, I do.
ask a question?
Let me take it from here for a moment.
Great.
Joel, let me really challenge you here. Maybe you're being too careful with us. I think you can go further tonight. Let's assume everybody will get it, and this will be taped anyway, so if it's not easy to understand, they can watch it again, right? There's an intention in the book, which you restate in various ways in the first chapters, and by about chapters 7 or 8, you start doing much more often, which is, see, this is my hang-up. This is something that, as I've told you, has been very important to me my whole career. And unfortunately, I actually have a degree in music aesthetics, so shows you how useless that is. That one of the convictions that goes back to when I was very young and still stands with me is there's a lot of complex mystery in a lot of music, right? As you know, a lot of music therapy of the more pragmatic kind and of the kind that usually starts with its basic explanation will be, this sounds sad, right? This sounds excited. This sounds fast. But particularly in symphonic forms, but also in any large form, you'll find it in many LPs of popular songs if they've been made particularly complex, a particularly big frame. You'll have something that will tell us about time, experience, changing time, meaning of life, changing meaning. Now, in your later examples in the book, from about chapter 7 or 8 on, those start to appear more and more. One thing I've always wondered is, how do we find those things? Maybe we don't have it feels as though many of our verbal explanations are very practical or very solid, very sort of focused on a particular musical element. But then our experiences can be very vast and complex, and they're hard to reproduce in language. But what I see in your book is you are reproducing them, communicating them in analysis when you're improvising. So what can you say about that, the bigger frame?
Yeah, when you use the word them, how do we find them? What do you mean by the word them?
Those bigger visions, those bigger images of what time is, or what meaning is, what the entire meaning of a period of time or an entire part of ourselves is. You know, a parallel would be, I had a patient, very sophisticated patient with big dreams a few weeks ago. He was having a dream that was very sophisticated, lots of detail, kept changing scene, and he kept being bored with it. And it was like, well, I think the dream world is saying, I'm tired of this kind of dream. I'm tired of this kind of life. So it was essentially a meta, it was really a meta dream.
I like that you brought in dreaming because of this link that I'm trying to make here that I think is a helpful link between the world of dreaming and the realm of musical thinking or musical experience. Yeah, the way I would approach that in this moment anyway is to look at why do we get stuck outside of knowing what you're trying to ask us to know? Why do we, what causes us to reduce, literalize, concretize, reduce ourselves so that we actually can't know this larger aspect? Maybe this is the Buddhist in me talking, but it's less of creating that knowing and more of discovering. It's already happening. We're doing the emotional labor to make it not happen. So it's more, for me, it's more about removing the deafness. You know, it's about removing the blinders and going, okay, when I don't curate that way, which is not easy, when I don't do that, I hear more. And let's say it even more provocatively, the unbearable aspect that my consciousness can't handle. I consciously keep this out of, sorry, not consciously, I keep this out of my consciousness for a reason. But in the right context, and I would say musical field is often the right context, literally or metaphorically, both. The unbearable aspect can exist. The unbearable aspect, the aspect that we're blocking from ourselves, can actually exist. The way I sometimes say it is, like a composer, we can actually be the midwife for sounds that do not yet know how to exist. All right. We can be the midwife that actually, you know, this is a bit of a heavy image here, but with blood on our hands, living blood on our hands, we can deliver that baby. We can deliver that new creation through our hearing, through letting that meaning-making system make meaning out of this experience. I hope that starts to answer the question. It's a big question.
I think the limitation is language, but who knows? How can we pin this down?
It certainly is. You bet.
And unfortunately, we've got 5 questions which are really substantial. Let me pick the first large one. This idea of what is not heard in music is extremely interesting. Richard Taruskin, in his book Defining Russia Musically, he talks about how certain arguments are avoided out of comfort to the detriment of the scholar. Does the psyche do this with what is heard and what is not for 2 people listening to the same piece of music? That's interesting. Well, does this lead to why individuals enjoy certain genres and have certain emotional responses? Thus, music can be used for therapeutic usages. I think there's several overlapping questions there. What would a response be?
Yeah, indeed, there are. It's such an alive field, theme, I think, because it gets a whole bunch of things going here for me anyway when I hear that question. One of the things that jumps to mind is the 2 centers of the psyche. Not only 2 different people listening to the same piece of music, which is very interesting to reflect on, but the same person listening to the same music at 2 different times.
Yes.
I mean, this is where it becomes even more mysterious, right? The same person can listen to the same music at 2 different times and have a totally different experience. This, for me, this is almost a proof of the 2 centers of the psyche. Not quite, but it's almost a proof. But I like to think of Jung's very classic map of the psyche, of the self-regulating psyche, with the ego as the center of consciousness and the self as the center of the total personality. And I like to imagine for myself, this is reductive, but I like to imagine for myself, how does the ego hear this? And how at the exact same time does the self hear this? I know that's quite a reductive way to look at it, but it's helpful for me to think about that. How does the aspects of my unconscious world, to use that frame, receive this and from the meta narrative, you know, the bilocated position, the meta narrative, and how does my ego listen or what I call anti-listening, choosing not to hear this or not to hear it in a certain way. Maybe I'm saying the same thing that I said before, but I think there's a lot of conscious work going here to not hear the larger, those aspects that can't make it into consciousness. It's actually tiring, I think, for consciousness to continue not hearing what is actually there.
Interesting.
I know that's just a drop in the water for that question. It's a very interesting question.
By the way, that question came from John Van der Wert. I should have said that.
Thank you.
Carolyn Bates, he's another sort of network of ideas. Joel, I appreciate your ideas. As a musical performer, I'm not sure I would equate foreclosure and resolution. Foreclosure would be to truncate the field and the process therein, but resolution, at the end of any movement or concert, etc., reaches a resolution that is often in itself transformative. Okay. I also appreciate the idea of bilocation. To sing in a symphonic performance is to be simultaneously aware of where, To sing in a symphonic performance is to be simultaneously aware of where one is in the score, as well as to be surrounded by the field of the music. Lose connection to either one, and the field is affected. Could you speak more to bilocation?
Yeah, okay. I mean, the first part of your question or your comment, very, very interesting comments, makes me think about, I do have a chapter on tonality. Chapter 13 of my book is about using tonality as a tonal center as the musical archetype of home, capital H, right? The archetype of home. And I make a relationship between tonality and home. And of course, tonality and tonal center immediately gets us thinking about resolution. You know, because in a tonally centered piece of music, what's more powerful than the experience of going away from the tonal center and the intensity it builds, and then going back to the tonal center and the experience of resolution, partial resolution, or what do they call it, like false resolution, right? You're going to resolve and then you don't. The composer tricked you.
And even if you never did, the resolution would be an implied problem.
Right, you're already in that world when you're in a tonally centered piece. I would say it's even true, I'm not going to go far on this one, but even in atonality, I think there's also a whole bunch of resolution and ways of working with resolution, of course, right? So it's not just tonality, but that's what it makes me think about is home as the archetype of centrality, return, source, birthplace, resolution, and then it can, you know, we can go in all directions here. We can go to the monomyth of leaving home, this whole journey, and then what you meet along that journey and what you manage to gain, what you manage to lose, and then the return back, you know. And it makes me think about maybe we could say tonal systems within different cultural worlds. You know, in the Western music, in most of Western music, it's fairly straightforward what tonality means. But in Western African music, where the tonality may be a central point here, maybe it's time related, and then you go all the way around the circle, and it takes a long, long, long time. And then eventually you get back to that point through all this kind of call and response and these asynchronous patterns that sort of take you around, or in patterns that sort of take you around. Southeast Indian classical music, same deal, where it's this huge circle that you go all the way away from, and then when you finally get back to it, maybe an hour later, you know, the downbeat comes an hour later, everyone in the audience who's in on it goes like this. Yeah. You see their heads go like this, right? And wow, they know something that I don't know, because I'm not, you know, in that culture, I don't get it. But somehow we just got back to the downbeat. So there's all these different ways of resolving, these experience of resolve. And I love to look at those cultural ways as metaphors for the psychic experience, for this experience of our own psyche. I think these all inform the experience of resolution or lack thereof, right? The lack of resolution is actually maybe even more important, more interesting.
Here's a question that goes pretty much the opposite direction. This is from Olivia Knox. To what extent do you think that your theories would work with a composer who has created and curated the aesthetic representation of their psyche through music? Gosh, that sounds like Mahler or someone. Would you still be able to hear unbearable aspects of the self? That brings Unbearable, which I'm also curious about, if you can talk more about.
Yeah. The piece of music that jumps to my mind is John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds, where not a single note is played, right? But what happens is the performer steps onto the stage, probably dressed in a tux, up to the piano, sits down, the audience claps, they sit down, they're in a concert hall, and 4 minutes and 33 seconds, the performer stands up and leaves the stage to tremendous applause. This kind of performance is a helpful image, I think, musical image, which says the music is what happens. We can go even further. Luciano Berio, the Italian composer, said in 1985, music is anything one listens to when one is intending to listen to music. So composers have already thought this through. You know, a lot of composers have gone there to these psychological places and these very interesting questions. And they've composed something as a response to these kinds of questions to try to really drill down into the meaning of this. What is this like? Well, so from your question, is this the composer manifesting their psyche in a kind of a musical form? Maybe, yeah, maybe as art is, maybe it reflects something about their psyche. Maybe it even reflects something about the psyche, not only their psyche, but psyche, right? Collective psyche, personal psyche, political psyche. I mean, we could really take this all over the place. We could take it into societal collective experiences that are happening right now. Dare I say the pandemic and the experience, or even Black Lives Matters, or political things happening in the United States, or in response to the United States, or all over the world. So we could take this into all these different realms, and I can't help myself but do that. But if we were going to really focus in on the essence of, does this actually reflect something about the composer's psyche? Is that part of the question?
Well, can I ask, I'm not sure what Olivia means, but just to clarify, I should probably get back to your book on the unbearable. But by unbearable, you don't mean painful. You mean something that can't really be compassed by the ego.
Nicely said.
Merely painful is much simpler. Painful is easy.
Yeah. Once you have the pain, right. Once you can have, like, it's like the capacity of pathos. When you develop the way I think about it anyway is the capacity for pathos, the ability to actually feel, to actually suffer the sufferable, is one thing. Very important. It's absolutely essential. But we're talking about beyond that. The unbearable is exactly what you just said. What can't yet enter even pathos. What can't yet maybe even be felt. And again, we're talking here now about the pre-representational content, if we can even say content, proto-content, before it's content. So how do we work with that? Well, it's very subtle. I get very vague in my mind when I start to imagine it. Well, there's a hint. I get very vague in my mind when I'm working at that level in the consulting room too. But maybe that's a hint. I'm getting foggy here. Well, we could use a musical metaphor. It's disorienting, musically disorienting. The music is I don't know where I am. I'm in the middle of the development section in the second movement, and I don't even remember what the melodies are. I don't remember the leitmotifs. I don't even know where I am. Well, that's a space that we find ourselves in quite a lot, right? I mean, in session and out of session, in relationships and personally, intrapsychically. So that's I think that's exactly it. That's the unbearable. That's what we're talking about. What we can't yet bear, but the point I'm trying to make is that the musical field has the capacity to let the unbearable exist even before we're conscious of it, even before we can be conscious of it. That's what I think is the important point. At this point, maybe you just either believe me or you don't believe me when I say that. But what I'm saying is, I hate to say it this way, but in 25 years of thinking about it, that's where I'm at. And I'd be very curious to know where you're at, each of you, anybody, is at with that kind of idea. Is it true? Does the musical field in its metaphorical vastness actually allow liminality, like real liminality, something that is not this yet or that yet? It's on the threshold. Can it really exist in the pre-representational state, in a psychoid state? My experience is yes, it can.
Excellent. Let me give you quickly two short, one is a statement from Carol Cunningham that I think links to what you were just saying. Music acts as a container for the unbearable while at the same time evoking the unbearable. That's
nicely put.
Yeah.
Nicely put. Yeah.
And then Maria Magdalena, one of our classmates, hello Maria, has asked, this is a big question. I don't know if we can completely do it, but I'd love to hear this. How can you distinguish when is it the ego who hears and when is the self hearing, or the reverse? Can we make this distinction?
Yeah, exactly. Great question, because this is exactly why I said it's to ask that question is reductive right off the bat, right? As if these things exist in absolute form. Of course they don't. It's theoretical, and one of the brilliant things I think that Jung managed to do is bring some words in multiple languages to these elements, these aspects of nature. These are aspects of nature. But the way I would approach that is, first of all, to live the question. Even living that question in the consulting room, in that moment of interaction where I don't know what's going on, but that question is helpful as a frame, as a framing device for myself. But secondly, what is going to put me back in accord with nature? That's borrowed a little bit from Joseph Campbell, right? He says mythology, to have your myth, to find your monomyth, is to put you back in accord with nature. And I love that image. And I borrow that image. I think the musical field, when we are in relation to it, I'm going to even say proper relationship to it, appropriate relationship to the musical field, letting it not foreclose, not overly resolve too soon. We actually are allowing the musical field to put us in accord with nature. And that phrase makes me think of the ego-self axis, Neumann, and that kind of imaging, the harmonious, some kind of moment of harmonious psychic state. We don't want to go too far there. We don't want to get into positive psychology, right? But that kind of experience can happen, I think, by letting the musical field do what it's capable of doing.
That's great. Thank you. There are several more questions, but we're about at time. Is there anything else you'd like to say to close today?
Oh, well, I think I've said a lot here. One of the things that I do like to say when I give presentations on this topic is I want to share with you just six, why is that not working? 6 points here. Sorry, I'm going to zing right through all these slides, but here you go. So these are the 6 principles that have come through working with this modality for about 10 years, Archetypal Music Psychotherapy. And these are the 6 principles that tend to arrive. So far, this is what I've managed to collect. When these 6 principles are happening, we're in the zone that I'm trying to describe. Mm-hmm. I'll go as far as to say that. That's what it seems to be true. But again, I don't want to get too formulaic. This is a process. This is not a world of nouns. This is a world of verbs. Like Blackfoot language, this is a world of verbs here. So everything is a moving part. And it's a process. This is a work in process. I guess that's what I want to say to close is I'm not trying to solidify these ideas. They're not trademarked and they're not, mine. But these are ideas that I hope get something going for you that's helpful and can help you hear the music that before you could not hear. So I'll close with that.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you, everyone, for attending. You'll pardon me, I should know this. I'm trying to remember who our next speaker is. Oh, of course I know. In mid-September, it will be Mark Winborn, who actually also taught at the Jung Institute. So a lot of us who studied there also know him well. It'll be great to see. Thank you very much, Joel. Thank
My
you very
pleasure.
much, everyone, for attending. Please take care, and we'll see you all in a month.